It's a great opportunity to join everybody at the Self Society Symposium again. Lauren and I, just a couple weeks ago, were in Istanbul, and we had lots of great conversations about what I'm going to be talking about today, and that is when the dark charismatic fails, specifically talking about Donald Trump. So this whole topic comes out of thinking about what's happening with Donald Trump right now in the second term. After his first term, and we saw everything that happened, I wrote a very large book about Donald from a psychoanalytic political position called The Dark Charisma of Donald Trump, in which I try to create a psychological profile of both Donald Trump and his devotees, as I call them, as opposed to Trump supporters. But these people are much more devotees than that. And I'm trying to understand the symbiotic relationship of Donald Trump and his devotees. You know, what about Donald is attractive to the masses, especially the white working and white middle class, both religious and non-religious, looking into what are the rhetorical and psychological methods Donald deploys to attract and retain such devotees, and a lot of which you can be found in a lot of what John was just talking about. The prophets of deceit. And also what accounts for the cultish faith many have in him, and many still have in him, even though he fails tremendously on a whole variety of issues. So through years of watching footage of Donald, reading his books, of course he didn't write them, but reading his books, studying his numerous biographies, a psychological profile emerged, and it's what I call the dark charismatic. Now, the dark charismatic comes from a bringing together of two things, the dark triad, as well as Weber's concept of charisma. Just to go back to Weber's concept of charisma, we're talking about someone who has unique qualities that aren't accessible to others. At least they're not seemingly accessible to others, and oftentimes thought of as being God-given, right? They are uniquely given to this individual. And, you know, there's if you're coming from the perspective of a devotee looking at Donald Trump, think about what you're seeing. You're seeing that he's done things that no one else has been able to do. The man was twice impeached and never convicted. He was twice elected as president, despite his impeachment, despite being indicted over 90 times. Despite all the crimes, the public corruption, he's never been held accountable. He gets out of everything. I mean, who else can do that? So if you remember that charisma is not a thing, it's not a thing in the world, existing in the world, it's a perception. So, but the perception is often based on observable facts, not just stage present, not just speaking ability, but observable facts like Donald Trump getting out of every attempt to hold him accountable. So when you have charisma and you bring it together with the dark triad, and the dark triad, of course, is malignant narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. You know, and we could think about the tetrad. Lauren and I talked about this with sadomasochism. But you got to think in Donald's case, his sadism is strong. There's no doubt about that. He loves to inflict pain, and he's often, you know, very giddy about inflicting pain. But his masochism is episodic and highly situational. So, and you see less of it in the second term as you did in the first, right? So in the first term, he was very masochistic when it came to people who he thought or he perceived had more power than he did. They were more capable of wielding power than he was. You know, you see that especially with Vladimir Putin. And whenever he was in the presence of Putin, he became like a little child. But there's been seemingly a change of consciousness in the second term as to who and what he is as the president of the United States. His self-deification is almost complete, and therefore no other power, no other leader of another country remains even close to him. So therefore his masochistic tendencies that you would see are almost non-existent in this second term. So his masochism is also tied historically to his marketing personality. You know, he would be masochistic around people who he thought would be helpful, for his business or his brand look. And so you see that back in the 80s and in the 90s, whenever he's around celebrities, again, he's almost like a little child around them, but associating with them was good for his brand. And you don't see that much anymore in the second term. Now, there is a political export to this psychological profile. The policies of the dark charismatic reflect the psychological profile of the dark charismatic. The policies become dark charismatic. So if we think about the policies he has right now, the narcissism, these are policies and practices that reflect the greatness of Trump himself, right? So think about the vanity projects in Washington, D.C., the Oval Office, his name on money, the John F. Kennedy Center, now he has Trump-class nuclear submarines, right? All of these things become a narcissistic mirror. The government itself is no longer the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It's the government of Donald Trump that has to reflect his greatness. It is his narcissistic mirror. And so you can see him doing this by, the parades for himself, the Great American State Fair, the Trump Arch that's coming, the ballroom that's coming, the reflecting pool. Such things are meant to further his self-imposed legacy as America's greatest president, which we will all have to accept because he says it's true, right? Not because we reflect back on the greatness of a president, but he's telling us it's true, and therefore we have to accept it. And he's given us the evidence of it physically in DC, right? And even his attack on Iran was meant to show his inherent greatness as a commander-in-chief. But of course, it wasn't supposed to expose him as a fraud, and which is what it's doing in many ways. But it was supposed to show that this guy could do the impossible thing that, over the course of 47 years, no American president could do, yet he could do it within a couple days. So his policies reflect his narcissism. The policies reflect the Machiavellianism of his personality, right? They often rely on trickery and deception to succeed. Now, of course, we know all politics in some kind of ways are marketing, but we think about the things that he's been doing. So the SAVE Act, right? It's based on the big lie, the false claim of widespread voter fraud. The SAVE Act is a piece of voter suppression legislation meant to rescue democracy, right? So we will limit democracy in order to rescue democracy. Of course, I'm in Michigan right now, and we just nominated Abdurrahman Al-Sayed, right? Beautiful human being. I got a chance to meet him and have dinner with him a few months back. Absolutely amazing human being. But of course, immediately when he won, it became, election fraud. You hear now Michigan is corrupt again and whatnot. So in order to rescue the corrupt democracy, we have to engage in this decapitation of democracy. Very Machiavellian. The nuclear threat of Iran, despite the fact that Iran has no nuclear weapons. The murder of fishermen in the fight against fentanyl traffic, despite the fact that fentanyl is predominantly coming from China and not Colombia or Venezuela. The accusing of innocent individuals for his mistake, like the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool, right? Now that, of course, happened, and that case has been dismissed. The immigrants, of course, are a threat to democracy. Therefore, we have to get rid of birthright citizenship. All of these are Machiavellian attempts to reshape the country, reshape the government in the way he wants to see it, which again reflect his greatness. But they're also psychopathic, and they have no concern for the suffering and harm they cause. These policies have no moral regard for those they hurt, whether they're Iranians, Palestinians, individual Americans, undocumented people, American soldiers, has no care whatsoever. So the policies, again, reflect the psychopathy. Now, Trump policies in the second term are more of a reflection of his psychological profile than in the first. In the first, he was a political novice, thus relied on establishment support to advance his goals. And this support often limited his ambitions. There were, as they said, adults in the room, and thus limiting the degree to which his policies reflected his psychological profile. Trump's policies in the second term reflect his psychological profile much more profoundly. by foregoing an establishment infrastructure around him for one based on personal loyalty, limitations on his policies can only be found outside of his administration, with the judicial branch being the most profound block on a lot of his policies. But of course, even there, it's limited, especially when it gets to the Supreme Court. Now, but what happens when the dark charismatic fails, right? When politically fails, especially economically fails, because in many ways he's not failing on, enriching himself or whatnot. So that's our question. What happens when the dark charismatic fails? So I contend that Trump ran for the president again for a few primary reasons, right? The first one was to escape justice, being indicted over 90 times and being convicted 34 times, of course, in New York. And possibly looking at a whole lot of more jail time. He ran again for the presidency, was the only position he could have in the country where he would be shielded from accountability, for criminal accountability. This prospect of facing justice, of possibly spending the rest of his life in prison, truly frightened this man. More than anything in his life previously. I mean, we all have our fears, whether they're rational, neurotic, or whatnot, but this frightened this man intensely. Once having won the election in 2024, he prepared for the presidency that would, one, shield him from justice, and you continue to see this in his policies. So he's a fugitive from justice, hiding out in the presidency and rebuilding the infrastructure of the federal government to make sure he never is held accountable. This also allowed him to monetize the presidency, which he could focus on after the threat of prison subsided. Remember, as soon as he wins the election in 2024, the Trump organization starts figuring out ways to monetize the presidency, even before he takes office the second time. So first reason, stay out of prison. Once that is assured, monetize the presidency. And the third one is to cement the legacy. So remember, he is the self-declared greatest president ever, even better than Abraham Lincoln now, right? Whom he no longer says was better than him as he did in the first term. Now he's greater than Abraham Lincoln. And remember, he's saying things like, I've done more for black people than Abraham Lincoln, right? His legacy is cemented not through legislative and international achievements, but rather through the imposition of himself on the physical space of Washington, D.C. and other symbolic entities. His name is now on our money. It's on certain passports. As I said, it's on the submarines. So we have Trump-class submarines now. It's on buildings. It's being put on airports, right? On and on and on, cementing the legacy of the greatest president ever. Not, we will always remember him, but he's making sure we never forget him and his greatness, even after he dies. And this reflects, of course, his insecurity about his worth as a person and as a president, because most presidents die or they leave office, and we, the population, later remember them and memorialize them by doing something. He's not taking that chance. He is going to force us to remember him as the greatest president. So because the establishment boundaries are no longer there as they were in the first term, he interjects himself into many things that normal presidents wouldn't, like the arts, sports, parades, and even decorating. Of course, you've all heard him talk about the new drapes in the White House and everything else, right? As well as other things that other presidents would, but he would normally not get involved in, such as war. He meticulously avoided doing anything that could start a war in the first 4 years. He did not want to mess with war. War would expose him as a fraud. You have to remember that he essentially understands himself to be a coward. And that's why that public persona is always the tough guy, because he is deeply insecure, right? But without these establishment guardrails, his dark charismatic psychology drives policy and practice. It is his psychological profile objectified, made concrete in the world. Thus, as to be expected, he is failing, as he always has. The more he can be himself, the more he will fail. For his whole life, he has advocated the King Midas persona, but in reality, everything he touches dies, and he knows that. Right? Her personalization of politics creates political failure, and political failure exposes him as a fraud, a con artist, a deeply fearful per eternus, the eternal child that C.G. Jung talks about. The last thing you're going to see, or I'll say something about, is that this sparks the politics of desperation. And the politics of desperation, as you're going to see in the next couple of years, is that he's going to become increasingly aggressive, increasingly rageful, rigid defensiveness, and hypervigilance, in the attempt to manipulate the system to allow him to continue to do what he has to do and to avoid justice. And that includes not leaving the White House when he loses power, which, how he's going to try to do that, we're yet to see, but it's almost guaranteed that he is not going to leave the White House once he loses power. Okay, with that, all done.
So now David Smith.